So this morning, I'm going to be talking about anxiety. And I've titled the sermon, How High Are Your Dishes Stacked? With a subtitle of What's Draining You or Making You Anxious? Now, I honestly wasn't particularly anxious about doing this sermon until last week as I was leaving church. Pastor John says something like, I hope you realise I put my holiday back a week so I can hear you preach this sermon. So I'm really hoping it lives up to your expectations. And that was the title of my last sermon, Great Expectations. Just, again, excuse my voice. Anyway, God gave me this picture, as you can see, last year, just after I'd preached at the dedication service for Oliver and our youngest son, Joshua. It was a picture of a pile of dishes mounted up high on a draining board in the kitchen, a bit like this. In fact, I'm not sure it was a wholly divine image or more a reality of what our draining board looks like on a daily basis, because this is a real-life picture from our kitchen. Because 3 children and 2 adults just generate masses of washing up. It's like running a cafe 24/7 with endless cups and cutlery. But there's 3 parts to this picture. The first part I've called A History of Hiding Anxiety. Next slide. The second part is the story of Job. And the third part I've titled When the Vultures Come Down, which might resonate from a sermon somebody gave last year. So last time I preached, like I said, it was on Great Expectations, and I used the story of Abraham to illustrate the way that we have to trust God and be obedient to his calling. But today I want to talk about the opposite and look at what happens when you're stuck in a dark place through the story of Job. And maybe you're feeling overwhelmed, like you haven't got the capacity to do what God asks because there's just too much going on, or the washing up pile or the anxiety is getting higher and higher and out of control. And that's when we need a change of perspective, or maybe a dishwasher. Now, I'm not a medical professional, but anxiety and mental health has become quite a big topic since the pandemic. According to the NHS website, anxiety is a feeling of unease, such as a worry or a fear that can be mild or severe. Everyone has feelings of anxiety at some point, but some find it hard to control their worries. As such, anxiety is often associated with fear. But fear arises when we're confronted with a specific threat, whereas anxiety is more an anticipatory fear, where the outcome we're not certain of. In this sense, anxiety is based on our own limited perspective that's incomplete because we just don't know the end point. The Bible doesn't explicitly state what causes anxiety, but Jesus himself knew that we as humans worry, and so he commands us in Matthew's Gospel. In Matthew 6, he says, Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body and what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? A bit of a gap. So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Because worrying just doesn't get us anywhere, does it? I saw a neat memo that says, on the next slide, yesterday is tomorrow, is today. And that gave me a complete change of perspective, because it's saying you've already arrived at today, and that was the tomorrow you're worrying about yesterday. So yesterday, when I could hardly speak and I had a banging headache, I was worried that I wouldn't be stood here today. But today, I can say God has already brought me through to today. But even though we know we shouldn't worry about the future, many of us still feel anxious, don't we? How many times have we felt anxious about waiting for something to happen? We all have to wait for things, don't we? Whether it's waiting to hear about a job, waiting to hear hospital results, or waiting for the bus when you're already late. Often we don't have a choice to wait. But today I'd like to look at the story of Job, who does wait on God, because he has to. He waits for God to deliver him from his suffering. And Job says, the next slide, I will wait for better times. I will wait till this time of trouble is ended. But first, the section on A History of Hiding Anxiety. Because this picture of the draining board is also one of waiting. It's waiting for the dishes to dry. because we don't dry up in our house. We just wait for the air to do its job. My mother-in-law does. She puts everything away as soon as it's washed. We just let it dry like that. You see, if you're coming round to my house, you won't actually see that pile, though, because this is behind-the-scenes VIP access only. Because if I know someone's coming round, it will suddenly be transformed into the tidiest place you've ever seen. Does anyone else do this? You see, I like to think of myself as quite house-proud. Well, I was before I had 3 children. I don't really like it if people turn up unannounced and the house is a mess, even if it's like workmen coming to do some plastering and make more mess. So if they turn up 30 minutes early, heaven forbid, and I'm there trying to make them a cup of tea whilst I'm frantically trying to do the dishes with the other hand, pretending it doesn't look like this normally. See, only certain people are allowed to see the house in a tip, like my mother-in-law, Wendy. I think it's all right if she comes round, because she'll understand. She's had 3 kids. She tells me it's all right if it's a mess. But anyone else, they need to think I'm on top of this at all times. Steve often asks, that's my husband, is the Queen, I think he means the King now, is the King coming today or something? And he'll be able to tell if someone's coming just by how tidy the kitchen or the living room is. But over the Christmas holidays, I know it's just been Easter, but I was writing this in January. Over the Christmas holiday, we had family come over to stay, and I was constantly stressing about keeping on top of everything, all the extra dishes and the new mountain of toys that Christmas brings. But why was I stressing about people seeing some dirty dishes and some toys? Was it anxiety lurking? Because as a kid, I'd had OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, to the point that I would hoover up 3 or 4 times a day. I'd wash up as soon as I saw a dirty dish. Everything had to be in place or I couldn't rest. So a pile of dirty dishes would have given me serious anxiety when I was younger. But I never really knew it was anxiety until I was older, when I realised it was me back then, trying to gain some sort of control over situations that I had 0 control over. Namely, life just feeling chaotic. But when I couldn't control my surroundings permanently, and it didn't give me any peace that I craved, I started to control the food I ate. So then I developed an eating disorder too. But that didn't give me any peace. Because the only time I got any peace was when I handed control over to God. So now I kind of tolerate the mess with 3 kids a little bit better. But why am I telling you this? Well, because we can often hide anxiety quite well. Like me, running around, tidying the house. It'll look the part when you arrive, but it didn't look like that an hour before. And nor will it look like that again until the next person says they're coming. You see, the outward appearance of the person sat next to you. They can look quite happy. They can be dressed quite smart. And they can look like they've got it all together. But on the inside, perhaps they don't. Our perspective of others is limited. And sometimes we might think we've got our own anxiety problem under control. And it might stay hidden well under the carpet for decades, and then it might rear its head at the slightest trigger. And for me, that's sometimes if people say they're coming round. And anxiety can take many forms. It's not just tidying up. It can be work, it can be money, health, weight. The list is pretty endless when it comes to anxiety. And this picture of the dishes stacked high to me is like a metaphor for all the anxieties and the fears and life's problems that we just pile up and we try to deal with them ourselves. It's the pile we try to exert control over when in fact more often we just need to share the anxiety with God and let Him help us. We need to load a dishwasher. You see, we can look at this pile of dishes and focus on the mountain of anxieties, but if you zoom out and put that picture into perspective on the next slide, the irony is there's a dishwasher sat right next to the washing up bowl under the worktop, that little black thing there. And now it is a Bosch dishwasher, it's not a Miele and it's not a Smeg, and so for the analogy to work you need to imagine that God is the ultimate dishwasher, so the dishes don't come out dirty of this dishwasher. You see, the dishwasher is actually a bit like an unwanted gift in our kitchen, because Steve, my husband, is the evening human dishwasher. Shock horror. On the next slide you'll see. He scrubs everyone's dishes every night, and he even has the superhero apron to go with it. That's a picture from a cafe about 10 years ago back in Durham. He was doing the dishes then as well. He was actually grating cheese, I think. He's got a block of cheese in his hand. But I think Steve gets some kind of satisfaction from slaving over the washing up bowl. The kind of, I can do all the dishes on my own. Or look how high the tower is, all these things that I'm dealing with. But God says we don't have to do them alone, because God's in control, and only His perspective is complete. And we often only feel anxious when our world is out of control. Even as I was writing the sermon in January, I was getting really anxious, trying to find time to write it. I'd only get 40 minutes in between the baby when he had a nap So one night, Steve left all the dishes to give me this extra hour to write it. But the next morning, the kitchen looked like this. And I could feel the anxiety rising. So I said, right, that is it. I am using the dishwasher in this new house for the first time ever. We've never had a dishwasher before. It come with the house. But my question to you this morning is, are you piling your anxieties up on the metaphorical draining board when God sat there right next to you, just waiting for you to load them in? What are you doing with your anxiety? We're going to look at what Job did with his anxiety now, because Job had every reason to be anxious and fearful. The threat was real. Satan had come to purposely test his faith and devotion to the extreme by taking away everything he had. On the next slide. We're told right at the start that Job lives in the land of Uz and is blameless and upright and fears God. But God grants Satan permission to test whether he really trusts God. In Job 1:12 it says, "And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person." So he was permitted to do absolutely anything he liked to Job, apart from kill him. So he goes ahead, and he starts inflicting so much suffering to see whether he will sin and blame God for everything. And on the first day of his experiment, Job receives reports that all his wealth, along with 10 of his children, have died. Yet he still praises God. So then Satan goes for round 2 and attacks his health, and he gives him boils from head to toe, but still, Job endures his inflictions. And then his friends come along, and they try to console him, but then they end up arguing and falling out and decide that all this pain and suffering must be from some sin or evil that he's done to provoke God's justice. But Job keeps maintaining he's done nothing, and God is good. But by Job chapter 3, verse 24, the suffering does get quite great, and Job becomes anxious and starts complaining of his seemingly undeserved suffering. He says, "Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For sighing has become my daily food. My groans pour out like water. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness, and I have no rest, but only turmoil." As Job's taken it to the next level here, and 100% understandably so, his anxiety's through the roof and he's had enough. He's literally been left on the ash heap of life. God has hedged him in with no direction, no next step. All the way to him is hidden. So he can do absolutely nothing. Every disaster's befallen him. His groans pour out like water. He's got no family, no property, and bad health. And he says he has no peace and no rest. I mean, have you ever not been able to sleep with anxiety before? Because that's often the first sign of an anxious mind, not sleeping, along with some of these other symptoms. So on the downward spiral into anxiety, you often get sleep deprivation, fatigue, stress, missed deadlines. You start blaming other people and putting the control out there, not on yourself. But on the upward spiral, when you're coming out of anxiety, then you start to get better sleep. You get more energy, you get a peace. You complete your tasks and you come up with this can-do attitude and you take control for yourself. And now as Christians, we often think that we can only be anxious if you're not in God's will and not doing it. And that we can only get anxious, and that we only get anxious when we're not being obedient to God. But the remarkable thing about the story of Job, and the key point here, is that he was showing signs of anxiety, but he was within God's purpose and remaining obedient. Why was he anxious? Perhaps it was because he was stuck in this fog. He couldn't see the end to his suffering because he had a limited perspective. We know from reading the story that Job actually allowed Satan to test Job, to test his character, to see if he would sin. But he doesn't. Perseveres right to the end and he waits. But in the waiting, he keeps seeking God's wisdom. So what does he do with his anxieties? Well, number one, he keeps pleading with God to answer him, and he keeps speaking God's truth to his friends. He prays constantly and reminds himself of God's goodness all the way through. In fact, the story of Job reminds me a bit of the ongoing post office scandal, and it's still not resolved, is it? Where you've got these innocent people, and they've been stripped of their livelihoods and wrongly accused of stealing money and made to suffer that something wasn't their fault. Like the 3 friends of Job who keep wrongly accusing him of having done something wrong to upset God. But just like Alan Bates, the guy that leads the whole project afterwards, Job perseveres and he waits. He waits. He waits for justice because he knows that God is good. The Bible doesn't say how long Job endured his trials, but for a period of time it was like being in God's waiting room whilst his faith was tested. And all we know that is God was on silent and mute all the way through the story, from chapter 1 all the way through to chapter 38 at the end, where God speaks to him through a whirlwind. All through the book, Job wants is to hear God. He wants God to talk to him and give him the reason for the suffering. But Job never gets any answers about why everything happens. The replies God does give to his questions, however, put the fear into perspective. He says, because what reason could Job have to fear really when the God of the universe is in control? That's the only answer he gets. So he concludes that God's ways and reasons for suffering are simply sometimes mysterious and beyond comprehension. And in the end, God does come through and he rescues Job and he restores double all that he lost. There were moments early on, though, just after he'd lost everything, and his wife turns up and she suggests just throwing the towel in because she sees her husband sitting on the ash heap, scraping all his sores, and she bursts out, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Just curse God and die." In other words, she says, give up. His wife says he should curse God for seemingly abandoning him and just lay down and die, to be over with it. But Job rebukes his wife in verse 10, and he says, "You speak as a foolish woman. How can we accept all the good things that God gives and not the problems?" So he doesn't blame God and take the easy route out. And last year, Lindsay Wildsmith came and she gave a sermon about remember, and it was about remembering what God had done in the past to pull us through in the hard times. And she said to build a monument to remember his faithfulness, as sometimes the vultures come down and our faith can get tested, which is what I'm going to share in this final section, some recent trials about when the vultures come down. As Pastor Graham had described at the end of his series on the altars of Abraham last year, straight after Abraham brings his sacrifice to God and the Lord promises him this son, in Genesis 15:11 it says, the vultures come down. And well, the vultures came down on me, and everything last year just seemed to go wrong. And quite often in the spiritual realm, when God's people set themselves towards living in God's purposes, the devil's vultures will try and thwart that plan. And they can come in many forms. People might laugh at your plans. They might get negative thinking or depression, and they might keep you awake at night or give you nightmares. And it was just a matter of days, actually, after the dedication service that I preached at, when Josh, the baby, had this really bad anaphylactic reaction to some scrambled egg. I wasn't expecting, it came out of nowhere. And his eyes just went bloodshot. And he went bright red from head to toe like a little lobster. And then he slowly passed out in my arms, and his tongue was hanging out, and I was just in like an absolute panic mode. And I dialed 999, and it was so scary. But thankfully, he shook himself awake, threw it up, but we ended up in hospital for a little while with some heavy steroids and antihistamines. But as a result of that single little incident, I'm having this anaphylactic reaction, my anxiety just went through the roof, just like Job's, because I was petrified. I was petrified to feed him anything in case he was allergic. It seemed that he reacted to everything, and then he stopped sleeping. And I think it's when the not sleeping happened, my mind was in overdrive and I couldn't sleep because I was so worried about him. I was so focused on trying to make him better that everything else fell by the wayside. I looked back at my phone messages to Deb, and I found one during that time that said, literally all of my plates are spinning, and I'm going to have to take a step back from helping out in the coffee lounge. And this was the one thing that I thought God had called me to do, help out in this coffee lounge. I said, just whilst I try and regain some control over life at home. But it wasn't that event in isolation that had made me anxious. It was all the build-up of the little things stacked up under it. And this is when the sermon had come to me, in the midst of the anxiety, because sometimes it only takes a tiny little trigger, like an unwell child, and the stack of dishes and responsibilities come crashing down. I remember going to the Quest toddler group on Tuesday upstairs. I just vented to one of the grandparents there about how it was one thing after another since we'd moved to look after my mum. We were trying to decorate our new house. 3 months later, Josh was born. 7 days after that, my mum died. 2 days after that, the baby ended up in hospital with bronchiolitis. Then we had a funeral to organise, 2 houses to renovate, and the jobs and the costs just kept piling up. And then lots of little things happened outside of my control. Someone stole Josh's pram, of all things. Someone set a fire to the garage in our old house in Durham, which we were renting out because we couldn't sell it. And Josh had this anaphylactic reaction to egg. And it felt like literally I'd taken up residence in the doctors because all my children were getting ill. And finally, the icing on this cake of disaster was that my brother had a mental health crisis. And that nearly sent me over the edge because I felt like I was drowning in this mountain of things that life just threw at me relentlessly. I felt like a bit like a soap opera every week as I went to the toddler group and told this grandparent that something else had gone wrong. But she said, "You're still smiling. How are you still smiling?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I am." You see, on the outside, it looked like everything was fine. But on the inside, it was literally crumbling. The stack of dishes was too high. It was like I needed the sippy cup from the bottom to stop the baby crying, but I couldn't get to it fast enough. And that's the great thing about a dishwasher. You're just semi-organised, isn't it? You just pull out the rack and it's all there. So I tried to get organised. I cut back on the cafe commitments for a while. I came off the rota. So I thought that was easy to sacrifice. But then my husband Steve challenged me. He said, "Why are you stopping that if that's the one thing you thought God wanted you to do?" His actual words were a bit more cutting though. They had to be, or I probably would have just come off the rota forever. He says something along the lines of, "Take some responsibility. Turn up. Change your perspective. Stop running away. It's not like it's even stressful. You're making it sound stressful." He said, "Just commit to something. And if you show you're worthy in the little things, then maybe you'll get some responsibility in the bigger things." And that was a challenge because the world was still swirling. But he was right. Why should I sacrifice the thing that I'd committed to do for God? Surely God had to be the priority. So safe to say I didn't send the text message to Deb. And I started showing up at the cafe again. And sometimes it's a lot easier to give up and throw the towel in, especially when we think we don't have enough time, to say, "Oh, I won't bother reading the Bible today," or "I'll just skip this Sunday," or "I won't do that on the rota." But on the 7th of January this year, the New Year's sermon, Pastor John said, "But what's your part in this new year? What's your part in the story?" And then he repeated it the following week, and I thought, okay, I better get down to business and write this sermon because I've been putting it off for nearly a year. So I thought perhaps I'll use some of the bad that's happened and weave it into this sermon to share, because sometimes we have to share things so that people know that what we're going through. And I thought I might just speak to someone here today. My brother told me about his mental health crisis. I had no idea, and it was almost too late. He almost threw the towel in on his life. It wasn't until it got to the point that he came round and he didn't say a word to any of us for 3 hours. And we thought something was wrong. In fact, it was Steve that noticed something was wrong. He said, "Your brother's not very talkative, is he?" You see, when we stop talking, when we have no friends to share our problems with, that's when problems start. Because we need friends. And when we stop talking to God, the same things happen. If we don't pray and communicate, how can he work? It was New Year's Eve, just prior to me writing this sermon. And I'd reached the end of my tether with Josh waking up like 100 times in the night. So you know what I did? I just shouted out to God and I said, "Will you get this baby to sleep?" And you know what? He slept through that night. I was like, he can. And it was almost like this prayer thing works. And in the morning I felt like a new person. But you see, if we don't ask, then we don't receive. The next slide. We all know the song, don't we? "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Ask and it shall be given unto you. Seek and you shall find. Knock and it shall be opened up to you." And if we go back to Matthew 6 where we started, the answer's right there in the passage too, isn't it? Seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. I saw a picture with a memo on it from a Christian friend's Facebook profile, and it's stuck in my mind ever since, and it's what's on your seats, on the chairs. It says on it, "Worry is a conversation that you have with yourself about things that you cannot change. But prayer is a conversation that you have with God about things that he can change." And it's saying you can continue piling all your anxieties up in your mind and worrying about them, or you can start sharing them with God through prayer. And sometimes it's like the dishes picture. We need a change of perspective, to zoom out, to see the dishwasher, and to gain God's perspective on the matter. And at the end of the sermon in a moment, I'd like to take a minute to write just one of your current fears or anxieties down on a piece of paper, on that piece of paper with the sentence on the back of it. And then when the tithe bags go around at the end, I'd like to just drop it in, along with the tithe if you're giving, as a symbol of giving and committing it to God. And then maybe over the next week, you might like to share that anxiety with someone else, whether it's your spouse, a friend, or someone in the coffee lounge. Because a problem shared is often a problem halved. And sometimes someone else might be able to help you out and put that anxiety into the perspective for you. Sometimes it does feel like God's on mute and all we can do in a situation is wait. or lean not on our own understanding, like Pastor Paul said last week. But whilst we're waiting, we can still pray and seek God. Job waited to hear God for a long time. But when he did, he wasn't disappointed because God did bring him through. Wait was the answer. My sister-in-law was given about my brother's mental health. God told her to wait for him whilst God did a work. Wait was the answer I got from the hospital consultant for Joshua. He said, eventually, he'll probably outgrow his allergies, and his enlarged adenoids which stop him from sleeping, would probably shrink by the time he's 5, so it's only 4 more years. It's a bit like he's giving me a lesson in patience, and I don't have much patience at the best of times. It's probably why I'm anxious. But the only way to teach us patience is to wait. So I'm going to leave us with Philippians 4, verses 6 to 7, which says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition and thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and mind in Jesus. Sometimes we'll never know or understand God's plans, just like Job didn't, and that is okay. Sometimes we just need to use the dishwasher and stop trying to deal with everything on our own. The help is always there, and God's always sat there right next to you, waiting to listen to your problems, just like the dishwasher in the picture, waiting to be used. So whilst the final song, which is a YouTube video, plays in a minute, we're just going to have a couple of minutes reflection, and I'd like you to, if you don't have to participate, but if you'd like to, just to write down one of your anxieties on the back of that piece of paper on your seats. You can just pray if you like. No one's going to read them as well. They'll simply be separated from the monetary ties and disposed of at the end. But I just thought it'd be a practical act to symbolise giving your anxieties to God. So I'm going to sit down and participate now, and maybe just give a minute or two until the bags go around. But I'm going to leave you with the song.
Stay steadfast, my soul. He's in the waiting. He's in the waiting. And hold on to your hope as your triumph unfolds. He's never failing. He's never failing. Stay steadfast, my soul. He's in the waiting. He's in the waiting. And hold on to your hope as your triumph unfolds. He's never failing. He's never failing. And you hold the star. He's in the way.